believe in there being, some level of pride and diligence put into the specs up front. I mean, we're seeing a real rise in spec-driven development in organizations. So this is going to become even that much more clear when your specs suck. There's going to be no hiding from it.
When we talk about AI and how teams are using that, actually turns out that less than 10% of the teams are using AI for helping with product requirements and product specs. I mean, is that surprising to you, or what do you think is the case?
100%. Yeah, 100%. I would have expected this statistic a year ago, 2 years ago. I was shocked to see it, popping up in the last 2 months since we ran the survey. It's crazy to me. I mean, I'm kind of speechless. I don't know. I don't know what to say.
Hey, Luca here. Welcome to a new episode of the Refactoring Podcast, where every 2 weeks we interview a world-class tech leader. Today's guest is Doug Peete, Chief Product Officer at Atono, with whom over the last few months we have developed a deep industry report about the state of product development. In this chat, we'll go through the main findings of the report, match them to our respective experience, and explore ideas about how teams can do better with product development and AI. So let's dive right into the action. Welcome, Doug, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Luca. Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. So, Doug, you're a CPO of Atono, which is an all-in-one platform for product development. And we have known each other for some time now, collaborating on various articles in the newsletter. And most recently, we have run a big research together on the state of product development, where we surveyed more than 350 teams to find where are the gaps and the problems today, how teams are using AI, and so on. And we published a report that was super popular, and a lot of people replied to me via email, also with more questions and thoughts. And so I invited you on the show to comment on some of these results of the report and take stock of what we have, basically. What do you think?
Yeah, pretty interesting results we saw. So I definitely want to talk about it.
Hey, before we continue, I was reading the X 2026 survey on how AI is impacting developer productivity, and the results were kind of surprising. One of the main call-outs is that AI tools still lack critical context. This is how they describe it. An AI assistant can't reason over a Slack thread from an archived channel or the mental model of the engineer who built it. So now that we are all coding with agents, it's clear that the gap is not a bigger context window or adding another MCP server. Until agents have the same tribal knowledge you have, the value you get from them is still limited. And this is exactly the type of problem our sponsor today, Unblocked, is solving for tens of thousands of developers. Unblocked is the context layer for modern engineering teams. It brings together your PRs, docs, conversations, tickets, and more, turning them into actionable context for both your team and their AI agents. Engineering teams that are getting ahead right now use a context engine like Unblocked to make better plans, write higher quality code, use fewer tokens, and spend less time in review cycles. So if you're running Claude Code, Cursor, or any agentic workflow, give Unblocked a try. Get a free 3-week trial at getunblocked.com/refactoring. Excited. So the first part, just to give people more context, we try to analyze and survey people on the whole product development process. So not just the coding part, which is what gets the most attention these days with AI and everything going on, but also going back to the first steps, like the planning process and what happens mid-cycle, what happens with how the knowledge gets shared, and a lot of these things that usually get a little bit less of focus and attention. And so we started by looking at the planning process. And one of the first findings that we got is that it feels like planning is extremely fragile for most teams. That is, more than 60% of teams discover routinely missing tasks and dependencies mid-cycle. They need a lot of clarifying questions. And this is also true for companies of all sizes. It's not like startups are doing this better than large corporations or vice versa. So it feels like an inherent problem of how we plan product development work. So if you compare this with things you see from your own experience and your own customers, do you see this problem? What do you think?
For sure. I I might have a bit of a hot take on it though, in that I'm not ready to call it a problem yet. I
Hmm.
certainly was surprised by the number 59% of engineering teams pointing this out.
Yeah.
I mean, it's high, but one thing that I'm always worried about are in the various organizations that I've worked in over the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Um, the companies that put too much effort in planning up front
Hmm.
oftentimes didn't have any more success in this discovery of missing tasks. I mean, one of the um, problems with planning is if you sit down at the beginning of whatever iteration, beginning of the story, like whatever process you're using, you just think really, 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 really hard about what it takes to get something done. That's fine, but most of the bumps that I see happening in the road happen because of the unknowns, and
Yes.
so I'm actually okay with there being mid process, mid workflow discoveries of missing stuff. It's going to happen. So that's the hot take.
Yeah.
But one thing that I would say, just coming from my side of the house, product, is that I've seen different disciplines for product managers. Some product managers being far more on the business side, less particular in the stories or specifications or whatever it is that they're building out. And in my opinion, that's where we do have a problem
Yeah.
when there's not that same level. I mean, think about what we expect our engineers to do with like peer review or paired programming, or
Yeah.
having multiple people contribute to the code base. I believe that PM stories and specifications need that same level of diligence
Mm.
and collaboration early on in the process. And
Yeah.
I've been having a great deal of luck, success. I don't know. I don't want to be so bold, but certainly the feedback that I get when I interact with, say, Claude's actually my LLM of choice.
Yeah.
Looking at my stories, peer reviewing my stories, the
Yeah.
conversations that we have. I mean, it's there. Claude doesn't always nail it in terms of what are the very specific things that need to get changed. I'd say its hit rates
Yeah.
maybe like 60, 70%. But the conversation is always super useful for me to discover the things that I didn't think of that would have emerged mid-cycle if we hadn't had sussed it out earlier.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so I want to go back to something that you said at the very beginning, which I think is very important. That is, uh, when it comes to discovering things mid-cycle, for example, there is probably a healthy and an unhealthy version of this, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
healthy version is that we should retain that kind of agility and have the and accept that we move forward with things to do without having the full picture, and then we adjust. But also, there is probably the unhealthy version of this. That is, we found roadblocks that were totally foreseeable, from the start. We've just been a little bit reckless in not creating good enough specs, and we are now having rework and frustration, and we cannot hide behind the fact that we are just being agile. Am I getting this right?
I think you're nailing it. I believe in that agility in the planning process, but I also believe in there being, some level of pride and diligence put into the specs up front. I mean, we're seeing a real rise in spec-driven development in
Mm.
organizations. So this is going to become even that much more clear when your specs suck. Like
Yeah.
there's going to be no hiding from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it certainly rings true when you said that historically we have put a lot of effort into uh, detailed and thorough like engineering work and even tech design, system design, but we've not put the same amount of discipline into product specs. I mean, for sure there exists, patterns, and we know what user stories are, acceptance criteria. But even if you survey teams about how widespread, the formalisms are about this is not nearly as widespread as, the equivalent for the tech side. What do you think is the case? It's just that product has always been a little bit less disciplined with respect to technology, or what's your take?
Yeah, that's a tricky question because it's purely from my point of view. I don't know, the way you phrased it, has product always been that way? But from my point of view, no. Actually, I think the
Mm,
role of product management has kind of evolved over the years,
mm,
and at some point there was like the product manager is the CTO of that part of the organization, or
yeah,
sorry, is the CEO of that part of the
this
organization, and
year.
you got to run your business, and then got really business oriented. And so we used to just have product managers, but then you saw the rise of like product owners, so that there was some differentiation between, well, the product manager is more owning the business, and then the product owner is getting in there and actually managing the backlogs. But in smaller organizations, you don't have both. And if you just have somebody with product management experience, then they often are not, I think, interfacing with the engineering team in the
Mm,
right way. They aren't
mm,
building these specifications. They're oftentimes leaving a lot of decisions or exploration to the teams to just sort out. And I don't get me wrong. I'm a big believer in making sure that specifications aren't too strict in telling the
yeah,
team how to do stuff too early. I want
yeah,
to fire up the team and all of their collective experience to help solve the problem and talk about the how. But that still needs to then come back into the specs and get codified there so that it can
yeah.
play through into the code that gets written. And I think the role of product manager over time has gotten a bit away from that, and it's more the product owner that is the one that has been making specs in the bigger companies.
Yeah, and I think that ties in nicely with kind of the next finding, which is exactly about specs and requirements. And basically, it turns out only one team out of four has for engineers in one team out of four, both success criteria and actual acceptance criteria are clear from the tickets and the feature specs that they work on and they receive. And actually, the surprising part of this is that the thing that feels the most unclear is not like the final goal or the success criteria, which is what we sometimes say that we need to keep engineers more in the loop on and so on, but more the actual details about acceptance criteria. So the more detailed specs about what needs to be done and what needs to look like and how it needs to work, as opposed to what success looks like. So did you expect this, or what do you think?
That doesn't surprise me. That
Mm,
that's that sounds about right. I mean, again, I have seen like an erosion of story quality in the different organizations that I've worked with, which is typically our spec, and that it seems like they've gotten higher level, and that then puts a burden on the team who is not always as tuned in to the end user needs as the product side and the UX side. So I do believe that stuff should be codified. I go back to my previous statements about the peer review and getting help and making sure that my
Mm,
stories are reviewed before I even get them in front of the team. But I don't know if this is old fashioned or not. But I do believe in the core ceremonies for teams. Now, I don't. I want to be agile. I believe they should be fast. But we do a weekly design review so that
mm,
the entire team can see the different things that we're working on. Now, it's optional. Folks don't have to show up, but it's their ability to be able to give
mm,
feedback into the specs that we're effectively building between PM and UX. It is a half-hour meeting that we do every week, and it does allow the team to get in there, give their feedback early, get
yeah.
acquainted with the stories, and it happens in advance of. We do our design review on, I believe it's Wednesdays. We
Mm,
do a weekly sizing exercise on
mm,
Mondays. That gives the time for PM and UX to take any of the feedback, incorporate it, and then let the teams know by the end of the day, Thursday, hey, we've got the latest updated version of what we believe will be the specs. Please take a look at it before we go into sizing. And then
yeah.
we do run a sizing meeting on Monday, and we can size any story in like 2 minutes. We use both the team doing their own poker session, but the
Yeah.
the Atono tool also has a AI tool that does sizing. It looks for
Mm,
similar stories in the backlog and then says, hey, is this story bigger or smaller relative to that? And then
yeah.
comes back and says, based off what I've seen before, I think this is small, medium, large, whatever. But
Yeah.
we can churn through those stories in about 2 minutes. But those stories are getting in front of the developers multiple times before they even write code. And then once we get the code going, I believe in a shoulder surf as soon as there's something that is demonstrable to be able to just make sure it's heading in the right direction. So I don't know if that's old fashioned or not, but as long as those ceremonies can be done fast and
Yeah.
effectively, I'm still a big believer in them in terms of making sure that we're building the right thing and that the developers know what the right thing is.
Yeah, I absolutely love to hear this because I think you're right in implying that this is maybe a time in history where some of these ceremonies are in some circles like less fashionable in a way, and there is sometimes this push for we don't need all of these agile with capital A. But I think if you keep things lean and you focus on what needs to be done, having checkpoints that are recurring that create pacing and rhythm in how people work are so effective in both driving works forward and also creating the feedback loop, right? I mean, creating the points in which managers can act and understand that something can be done better. Otherwise, if you don't have cycles and ceremonies, in my experience at least, everything becomes harder to act on because you don't have like the breathing and the pace of your team.
Yeah, and we certainly, again, this could sound old fashioned. It sounds like we're in some agreement though that we both like it,
Yeah,
so maybe we're both just old fashioned. But
yeah,
there are different techniques that we use to make sure that these things stay lean. Like a lot of the shoulder surfs that I get now are recordings that are just placed into Slack,
mm,
and that means
yes,
people can watch them at their leisure, but we still can capture the thread of comments, of feedback that happen
hmm,
relative to what's going on in the shoulder surf. So there are ways to make sure that we're making good use of people's time. And
yeah,
also, in this day and age, we're oftentimes dealing with very different work schedules, whether that's because it's just flex schedules or whether it's because you have people in very different time zones. There's ways around this now that still allow people to collaborate and get stuff done.
yeah, absolutely. And I think technology has helped a lot with that. I mean, I remember, 10 years ago, back in my days, in my startup, when you would have maybe big meetings in which, just in case, you would have everyone attending or many, many people attending, because otherwise they would maybe miss relevant details. Otherwise, I think what you're saying is that today you can have like people who are mandatory to join, and then a long tail of people who may join or just get the recording with chapters and timestamps and AI summaries and takeaways and
Absolutely.
action items, and so
Don't
just
forget
consume.
the
Yeah.
1.5x speed. I know
Yes.
I'm not the only one that's speeding up these recordings when I
Yeah.
listen to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious. I mean, going on a little bit on a tangent, but I'm curious. You say you do like these design reviews, and are they open to the whole team? So like PMs, designers, engineers. I mean, how do they
100%.
work? It's out of
100%.
curiosity. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of Marty Kagan.
Yeah.
Not sure how familiar you are with his work, but he believes in cross-functional product teams. I think the definition of what that is certainly being challenged as some of our product team is becoming agentic. But I still think that it takes cross-functional representation to get the specifications right, whether it's humans that are going to work on it or agents. Either way, I think that collaboration, that unique perspective that different people bring from their different shared background, it's all important, and it makes for going back to the first point about planning being fragile and stuff being missed.
Yeah.
The more unique viewpoints that you get, I think the better. And so you always have somebody on a team that has a good eye for the end user and their struggles. There's always
Mm.
somebody on the team that seems to do a good job of proxying the
Yeah.
security requirements and needs. There's always somebody on the team that does a good job of proxying like performance issues. And so bringing all of these folks together earlier on is important. I'll misquote Marty, but he talks about something along the lines of, if the first time the development team sees a story is when they're supposed to work on it, you failed. So
Mm.
yeah, our design reviews are open to everybody on the team: PMs, UX, engineers, quality. They're actually open to anybody in the company to come. What I do see is that we maintain design reviews that are specific to backlogs, and
Yeah.
and therefore either team or if you have shared team sharing backlog. But the folks in the organization that really care about the product in different teams on different backlogs oftentimes will want some visibility into what's going on, just so that they can provide some
Yeah.
of their points. Because as a company grows, people that were working on something oftentimes get spun off into another team, but it's still their baby and they still care about it. And
Yeah.
I love when people feel that way. Like, that's
Yeah.
been one of my challenges with PMs is to so in some of the organizations I've worked at, I've had a lot of PMs in my organization reporting to me, and the ones that would do best would really consider the product their baby, and
Yeah.
put that level of care into all of these decisions. And so I love it when I see that in PMs. I love it when I see it in engineers, QA, UX. Like,
Yeah.
that's what makes it good.
Yeah, and also, I mean, it makes me think that you're building a product for product people and developers. So I guess that should be uh, one of the key factors also behind the fact that you can have a lot of dog fooding internally. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's is that kind of a cheat code, to
Yeah,
develop a
I was
product?
thinking cheat code too. It's
Yeah,
funny you said that. Yeah, it's a little bit not fair,
yeah,
because of that. But I don't know. Over my years, like, I've worked at ERP companies. I worked at a crisis management company, and
mm,
when as a product manager, you do a good job of getting to know your customers, working with your
Yeah.
customers. Ultimately, you have to represent them. You are their proxy. I do think it's possible. Like, I've never been an emergency management
Yeah.
director in my life. But I can play one really well on TV because you get that passion, and if you have that
Yes.
passion, you not only are as good as any one of them, but you actually have, as a product manager, the unique ability to channel many of them. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a PM skill that when I'm looking at the folks on my team, the ones that I can see doing that, I'm like, they're going to be just fine.
Yeah, love that. So to wrap up, let's say that this segment about requirements and specs that we have been talking about. So
Yeah.
basically, we have said that in the report we are sitting and looking at the fact that 3 teams out of 4, at least engineers on these teams, are saying that our requirements suck. Okay, they're confusing. We don't understand them. And you clearly have a great experience making your team participate in these. And so, what's your take about how do you make requirements not suck? That is, do you
Yeah.
rely there are templates, PRDs that you can follow, or the secret sauce is simply, as you said, broad participation, having people involved early on. If you had to
Yes.
point to one thing that this is what enabled us to have great requirements and specs that people understand and allow us to build great product.
Yeah. The latter. So like I said, I do believe, like, peer review with AI, I think, can really help up level stuff before you get it in front of other
Yeah.
people, so that I mean, everybody's nightmare. I don't want to look like an idiot in a public space,
Yeah.
but I want the engineers to be able to say that this spec sucks earlier,
Yeah.
right? Because if they say that early enough, we get it fixed before there's actual hands-on keyboards or code being generated from whatever mechanism. So it is that collaboration piece early that I think cuts this off at the path. I mean, nobody's perfect. Not all specs are
Yeah.
going to be perfect. But so that opportunity to find those gaps and problems early and get them fixed is important.
Yeah, I love this take, and I completely agree. And so I want to segue into something that it's another finding from the report, but it's probably slightly correlated. So I want to get your thoughts about this. That is about how knowledge gets shared across the teams, because what we found is that it's not really shared a lot, or at least most 2 teams out of 3 believe that critical knowledge mostly lives in key people's heads, and they don't really feel like relying on written down documentation and information about what exists, how we do things, because this stuff either does not exist at all or is scattered across so many like incoherent or redundant sources that it's not to be trusted. Really, you have to get to someone who knows
Yeah.
better. Maybe that's related to the requirements problem also. What do you think? Is that your experience as well by working in many contexts?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, context is a word that we're hearing so much these days, and
Mm,
folks want to context engineer
mm,
and capture knowledge. And I think engineers are acutely aware of this and have gotten out there and the, my in order to get AI to do what we want it to do, there is a number of pieces of context that it has to know. I mean, it has to know coding styles, it has to know how you build your code, it has to know, what the different services you use, like all the stuff that relates to the technical side of things. It has to know what the product currently does, and that's a piece that I don't think is as well captured these days.
Mm,
And then it has to know what it should build. And I think in that regard, that context is really that's the spec, which is typically a story. But that gap around the product knowledge is something that I see quite a bit in the organizations, and it's something that I've taken a bit of a personal journey to try and figure out how do we capture that and make
yeah.
sure that it's shared so that what one thing I do find slightly tangential, but when I look around at any given organization, very few organizations I think are able to have the same level of success using AI technologies. If you're Anthropic, they're talking about 90% of our code is agent
Yeah.
generated,
Yeah.
but I don't see that being the reality in most of the companies that I talk to. What I do
Mm,
see is that there are, I call them tremendously clever individuals, TCIs, maybe, I don't know. But they figure it all out, and they have all their different files. Look, I've got these markdown files to cover this and that and the other, and I'm checking them into GitHub, and anybody can use them if they want, but it's not really mandated in the
yeah.
organization, and it's really only being built by a few individuals, and they're really knowledgeable in their area, but then it starts to
Yeah.
fall down the farther away that you get from it. And so I think the real trick is, how do we make everybody in the organization a tremendously clever individual and have them all singing
Mm,
from the same songbook? And so I think there, in my world, back to that personal journey, there are a couple of things that I want to make sure happen. One is product context around what the product currently does. I want to make sure that that is well established, so that if any
yeah.
decisions are being made in the early design planning type process, they're informed by, one of the ways that you build great applications is consistency. I don't want to go to different pages and have things work completely differently. I don't want my application to be like a children's discovery table where everything you
Yeah.
push behaves slightly differently. So knowledge of how the product currently works, what it's currently capable of, is hugely important in building the plans properly.
Yeah.
But then as you make decisions around how are we going to do it now, there's discussions that the team has, and there's discussions that I have with AI, being able to capture those design decisions, which, a lot
Mm,
of it gets captured into the ACs, but not all of it. Some of the why is oftentimes not in the AC. Some of the things that I decided not to do is also not in the AC. And so as you begin
yeah.
starting to actually implement the spec and you realize, hey, there might be something off here. Maybe I'll try this other way and go back to the PM and say, hey, look, I did it this way. Does this work? If it's already been identified that that doesn't work, all of that sort of context, I think, is important to capture.
Yeah.
So the solutions within our own product, Atono, are designed around being able to, one, generate product context and then hand it to the different systems that need it. The other is this AI context and design decision context, and putting this in a central place. Now, I know technically I'm a vendor. I know most vendors come on to shows and they say, I have the solution. This is what you have to do. Um, I don't have all the solutions. The way that all those design decisions and then like implementation plans, like Claude plan mode type
Yeah.
information on the technical side, all of that information, I'm putting a lot of effort into capturing and
Yeah.
formatting, because I believe that it will have powerful usage as software ages, or as you continue to build on it. You're going to need to go back to those core fundamentals of why the design is the way that it is. And I'm
Mm,
trusting letting AI drive and capture all that information, and then let it have access to that information and update it. So I don't have metrics. Like, this is where I think a vendor
yeah.
would say, that's going to solve everything. And I
Yeah.
can't prove that yet. But I'm a big believer in instrumentation, and
Mm.
you can't act off of what you don't capture. So we're capturing all this information and then seeing how it's fitting into the different agentic workflows that we're seeing rise within our customer base.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much an open problem because I think today there is this, I think, huge opportunity in capturing more things, more information, and more context because AI can make great use out of it. That before maybe it was useful for humans, but to a certain extent, or at least there was, there were real trade-offs that you could evaluate about whether capturing and maintaining up to date more or less documentation. And I think what's still at least not clear to me is what type of information and documentation you may capture and how. Because I mean, you mentioned different things. For example, for sure it's very important to capture what exists today, like how the product behaves, right? But also what decisions we made and why. So the why behind
Yeah.
why the product behaves like it does today. But even things that maybe have been superseded and are not true anymore, maybe there is a history of why the thing that does this thing today behaves like this, right? And so how do you capture all of that? I mean, if you are a person, you remember that history in your head, and that's what we mean when we say tribal knowledge. And so you can connect the dots and make the right design decision. But if you want to pass all of that to Claude, maybe Claude would have the intelligence to make that decision if it had all this information. But how do you capture it? How do you keep things up to date? I think the jury is still out on that. I don't know if
Yeah.
anyone has a good solution that works on, for the long term.
Yeah. Again, I see vendors saying they have all of the answers, but
Yeah.
it doesn't actually hold true when I start pulling it apart. Um, I, I do think that AI has a pretty solid ability to summarize, right? Like we see it doing
Yes.
it all the time. Summaries help out humans. Hey, here's the summary of the meeting type stuff. But it's also for its own self-preservation as it's trying to manage context windows. And you have these gigantic
Yeah.
conversations, and then it's every so often it's like, I'm going to summarize this. And so, right now, again, I'm trying philosophically to let AI drive more, and in my background with like enterprise class systems, I've always tried to like force things into specific data structures, and here's a decision record or something like that would have been the way
Yes.
that I would have tried to solve this 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But now I'm not. I'm actually usually just trying to provide some storage for markdown content to let AI
Mm.
populate what it needs to with a markdown, get to it, adjust it, manage it over time. With all of the powers of AI, it has, I believe, a very solid ability to do what used to take ETL tools in the past. So if at some point we decided, I don't want this in Markdown anymore, I want this in a structured format,
Yeah.
you can have it do that for you.
Yeah.
Take this large document and I want you to convert this into these structured records. Go.
Yeah.
So I try not to worry too much about format, because with all of the exploration that we're doing in terms of what is the different contextual elements that actually help an agentic flow operate autonomously, in that discovery, I think we should be worried about going fast. And so I
Yeah.
get there through just not worrying as much about the structure, letting AI kind of guide it, and usually the answer ends up being Markdown.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it has an incredible capability in mangling different formats and just figuring out things, even if you give it very little instructions, about what the format is, how it works. And it makes me think. I mean, we have been talking about AI and workflows and shared docs and artifacts. Actually, one thing that came out of the report is that maybe it's surprising, maybe not, but most teams actually don't have a lot of shared AI context, documents, even just, Claude.md files. The majority of teams don't even have that. They have what you call like the tremendously clever individuals that
Yeah.
patch together things for themselves, and they become like 10x or 100x engineers inside the organization, but they're either keeping their secrets guarded, or I mean there is no structure to create this shared progress as a team. So what are you doing to enable that instead, and why do you think it is the case that I mean, on one end we're seeing 90+% of individual AI adoption. I mean, every engineer, every PM is using AI, but we are still far behind when it comes to how we work on that as a team.
Yeah. Uh, with more determination, I can answer it, from the product standpoint, where the context is product context, and where the context is the spec, the story. With less confidence and swagger, the answers for the engineering team and all of the concerns that they have isn't something that I would say with any conviction. What I think the trick is for organizations and product managers, product owners, is to give the team time to figure it out. Like what I find is that stuff off the side of the desk, then done off the side of the desk, typically becomes that domain of the tremendously clever individual, as opposed to figuring out how to do it at scale for the organization. So just like you would have SREs and architects and other like folks thinking about what are the different practices that we have for engineering, and oftentimes you have people that focus on like all the build tools and the QA tools and all those other things. I think you need to provide the team time for individuals to perform those roles in building out the context required. As you point out, there's rules files and the Claude file and all the different things that help define the syntax style and where everything lives, and the things that are like above anything else, never do this sorts of directives that need to get
double exclamation points. Yes.
It is always funny to me when I do interact with AI and I don't get the result that I want from the prompt. I'll often ask it like, "What? Why did I have to correct you on this? How could I have phrased it better in the original prompt?" And it will come back with like something where it's saying it's adding to the sentence that I had in my prompt to say this is important in front of that part of the prompt. And I'm like, how does this work from like a rules engine standpoint? Isn't everything important? But neither here nor there. I don't think that product managers are usually giving the teams time that they need to do this. The tool that we build, Atono, on the software project management side, I think is the right place to be able to have things like product context, and the stories are obviously going to come out of us. But developers, the vast majority that I talk to use GitHub. I think I see GitHub in about 98% of the customers that I talk to. And so I would expect those files to be well-defined, shared amongst the team, with the scoping appropriate. Like you might need different rules files for this area of the code. Hey, we have a repo for the front end versus the back end. Those will have different rule files, but that needs to be considered a first-class part of either backlog, or what I have seen done at some organizations is that there's a tithe. So when you look at the overall velocity of the team, you basically carve out some of it to say, look, PM, you don't get to say what happens in this little piece we just carved out. You get this for all of your, fun
Yeah.
story building. But then this other piece here is where the team can do their tool sharpening. And so
Yeah.
then the team has the autonomy to do the tool
That's
sharpening.
the question I would have asked you when you say time, whether you think this should be implemented simply as, adding more slack, the to each individual task, to embed some of this into each activity, or some like intentional time every cycle for sharpening the saw, right? And
I
that
think,
is just
yeah,
about that. Yeah.
I think it's the latter. I
Mm,
don't think PMs are the ones to be driving this kind of stuff. I want PMs and product owners to be acutely aware of the user, the actual customer, and able to represent those things. And I want their time spent on building great
mm,
specs, meeting with customers so that they can represent them in those specs. I want their time on that. I believe that the craft of building the product is best defined by the engineering organization. I like to see team leads that take care in this and have good instrumentation around the team's velocity and how is the I love to see teams that are able to scale linearly when they bring more resources on. It's
yeah.
pretty lame when you hire somebody and you don't get the
Diminishing
same.
returns. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I really like to see team leads that have an eye for that. So when
Mm,
we're looking at who gets promoted into a lead position, I like to look at the analytic capabilities of that
mm,
person. You're oftentimes are giving the best coder the team lead role, but that's not actually,
yeah.
I think, what makes a good team lead. They're the ones that are good at
Yeah.
motivation. They're good at figuring out the process
Yeah.
problems. They're very data oriented to figure out where is any given bottleneck and then approaching the problem, like you said, in each iteration with some dedicated time to say, all right, I have noticed that what's holding us back now is this. It's
Yeah.
testing. Let's go ahead and put in some
Yeah.
time now to see how we can improve that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the obstacles to do that is also being aware of what is holding you back, right? I mean, if we are talking about AI, um, I think it's really great result if you develop that kind of awareness to be able to say the thing that AI is getting wrong the most of the time is this, right? I mean, it's either testing or that interprets poorly, specs and stuff like that. I mean, what's the part of the pipeline where we are the most behind and where we need to, human intervention to save the day. And I think it's still very much unclear how to measure how I performs on all these various steps. And I don't know if you figured out something, but it's still pretty much obscure, how to instrument. You talked about instrumentation
Yeah.
observability. I think it's very important, but still unclear how to do that right, I think.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the metrics that we currently use are fairly gross in terms of velocity averages, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is an age-old practice, but I still think gives you top-level views into what's happening and, are you able to get that, linear increase every time you staff somebody, or if you bring
Mm,
in a new technology that's promising a velocity increase? Do you actually really see it? A productivity increase? Do you actually see it resulting in more velocity? Yeah, certainly instrumenting that is there's probably going to be more metrics that we have to throw in as
yeah.
teams go from co-piloting with
Mhm.
AI to having pieces of their workflow being done agentically to having like end-to-end work get done agentically. I think there are going to be different metrics that arise that are important. But this is different. But I think that it's also just culturally important that yes, you can have reserve time to say, hey, look, I think that there is something broken at a major workflow level that needs to be
Yeah.
addressed. Yes, that's good. But culturally, I do think that it's important that engineers be coached that when you don't get the right result from AI, oftentimes it's like, it doesn't know how to write Java. It does fine with, with
Yeah.
Python, but it doesn't get Java. And I'm like,
Yeah.
that's not actually an okay answer. Like, is there something that you can do back to the various rule files and other things here where you can teach it to
Yeah.
do this better next time? Fix the inputs into
Yeah.
this. Don't just say that it's broken. And so I don't think all of this refinement around the various tools that the developers have happens in that carved out tide. I think it's up to every single developer to figure out how to maximize the results for their area of the code base and contribute to it. So
Yeah.
those context files should have some level of peer review and
Mm.
other sorts of diligence, because everybody should be contributing to them, right? I mean, this should be pull requests, and when mergers are happening, they should be reviewed.
Yeah. Yeah, they become a core part of your platform. I mean, that ensure the
Yeah.
productivity of the whole team, and they should be discussed. And I think, when you find something that works, it gets shared across the team by default. I mean, it's part of the platform of the overall product. I wouldn't even know how to call it otherwise, and I completely agree. And I think the last stat that I wanted to share with you, that it's from the report, that it ties in nicely with this, even if it's a little bit depressing, is that when we talk about AI and how teams are using that, actually turns out that less than 10% of the teams are using AI for helping with product requirements and product
Oh,
specs. I mean, the things
yeah.
that we have been talking for an hour, that just 1 out of 10. Is that surprising to you, or what do you think is the case?
100%. Yeah,
Mm,
100%. I would have expected this statistic a year ago, 2 years ago. I was shocked to see it, popping up in the last 2 months since we ran
yeah.
the survey. It's crazy to me. I mean, I'm kind of speechless. I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know what to say.
No, also because I mean, if I need to reinforce it and make it even more speechless, I think from the outside, sometimes you look at the zeitgeist and it feels like product managers are the most AI peeled, and the AI ready people in the product development space. Instead, it feels they're not, after all.
It's Yeah, it's shocking to me. I mean, I guess when I look at the role of a product manager, and why I've always gravitated to product management over the years. Again, I've been in product management for a long time. I've been in engineering, sales, consulting, like other elements, but I always come back to product management because the role is to interact with so many different parts of the business, and the that sort of I don't know, the knowledge that you have is oftentimes like, hey, look, I have to represent UX, I have to represent marketing, I have to represent sales, and it's a hard thing to do. And when I'm interacting with AI, I find that it helps me get those perspectives, because AI will
Yeah.
oftentimes act as a junior UX resource. So it will act relative to sales concerns. It will be able to represent marketing concerns, technical concerns. Like a lot of the conversation that I have with an LLM while I'm building out my stories is just
Yeah.
that discovery of other concerns, that
Yeah.
as hard as you try to represent them all,
Yeah.
the AI acts as those other like team members. So
Yeah.
when you use it, hey, PMs out there, if you want to feel like not just an army of one, but like an army of many,
Yeah.
even though it's just you, bring your AI minions along, because
Yeah.
it can really help you get stuff done.
Yeah, and if you had to guess, I mean, by thinking about your own AI usage that is successful, and trying to guess uh, instead what is something that other product managers maybe are not figuring out, what that might be. I mean, do you think it's about creating good workflows or templates or default styles of interaction, so that when you have to ask something about product specs and ideas to an AI, it's repeatable, it's easy to do, and maybe there are other people for which this is hard to do because they haven't developed any kind of infrastructure and good defaults around that. What do you think is the bottleneck or the problem?
I mean, you do have to get to know your tools well enough. Again, cheat code. I'm using Atono and building Atono, so
Yeah,
I'm really knowledgeable in the tools. But all said and done, like with an MCP tool, with the MCP server and Claude desktop, I can bang out. I have no blank page issues. I
yeah,
can have a conversation saying, I pass in the product context saying this is what our product does. And then I say, hey, look, I want to add such and such. Let's talk about it. We have this conversation. And then I say, okay, let's build some stories, show them what the stories would look like. That I get asked questions and this sort of interaction at the end, I'm usually able to say go, and it
yeah,
creates the story literally right
yeah.
in Atono,
So
which
you
is
start
super.
very early. You start very
Yeah.
early, like a thinking partner with the bouncing
Yeah.
ideas off. Yeah, helps refining your thoughts and so on.
So there's that. I'm oftentimes able to say from that, say, show it to me. I want to see a mock-up. And it'll build HTML mock-ups. And I think one of the things that's hard for people when they're building products is, a lot of usability isn't in a screen, it's in the transitions between things. And
Mm,
so interactive mock-ups, really help you envision, like, am I disclosing the right amount of information at this level versus
yes.
clicking and then seeing more? Like I was just working on a feature to be able to take a story and split it into two stories, interacting with hierarchical acceptance criteria, where you place that click or unclick, what do you expect it to do relative to selecting all the children. Having interactive mock-ups really helped refine in my mind what needed to get done before I handed it to UX. So that piece, I think, is greatly facilitated to say, show it to me. But then the other piece that I see is just like productivity wise. Once you start getting going, like if you're working on an epic where that feature is actually a big feature that we're talking about, that could be 8 stories. I can churn those out lickety split. But in something like I had a session the other day, and within like 4 hours, I had built out 30 different stories because they were all interrelated. It was a bunch of
Wow.
MCP tools that I was building.
Yeah.
And the ability to be able to go through, and because MCP should be like an API in terms of it should have a consistent style to the way that you do everything, because I did it all within the same chat. It's
Yeah.
just aware now of the design decisions that I've been making, the format that I wanted things in, the team
Yeah.
I wanted stuff assigned to. So, I mean, I could just bang stuff out. There's no way I could have written that many stories in that little
Yeah.
time without that technology. So it's a
Yeah.
huge productivity booster for me.
If I had to guess, for the different one of the key differences between how you use this and some other team that is not at this level, I think the fact that your Claude and AI has the whole product context about how things should be done, what exists, that's really a killer factor, because you can probably, just in a couple of lines describe your product intent about something you want
Yeah.
to build, and Claude can figure out so much about what you mean by that, how it should be built. Maybe create you say an interactive prototype or mockup, but maybe that's already kind of high fidelity, right? Because it can build on the design that already exists. I mean, something that it's kind of faithful, if not the real thing, of course. But
Here's
and
some
so,
here's
yeah,
some here's some honesty on that. I I have very few stories where the mock-ups that I'm generating through AI are the
hmm,
only visual artifact. At this point, the UX team is still putting stuff through Figma, and so we're trying
yeah,
to figure out like what are the workflows to actually automate that.
yeah,
But I do just want to fully disclose. Again, I think most vendors are like, yeah, I had just works. But yeah, we're still experimenting with that, and what stories lend themselves to not having to go through that. But also, like, how can we just automate more of that?
Yeah.
Let's generate the Figma artifact as opposed to what came out of Claude doing some
Yeah.
vibe mocking.
Yeah, I think it's especially useful, as a direction. I mean, directionally, you should be thinking that you give more and more context so that your prompt about what you want to build is smaller and smaller because the AI can figure out more things by itself.
Totally.
Yeah. So, Doug, thank you so much for this great chat. I loved your comments about our findings on the report from your own experience. And I guess we'll run this maybe 1 year from now and see if we have improved on some of these stats.
Yeah. Crossing my fingers. Let's go, product teams. We can do better.
We can do better. Thank you so much,
Right.
Doug. Thank you.
Have a good one, Luca. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this chat valuable, you can subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review, as that really helps other listeners find the show. You can find all past episodes and learn more about the show at refactoring.fm. See you in the next episode.